So in the previous lesson, what we did was spend some time talking about the administration of India as part of imperial consolidation and liberal rule between 1890 and 1914. This lesson is continuing to talk about this area of imperial and colonial policy with specific reference to the administration of Egypt. So, like I said, we talked about the administration of India in the previous lesson as part of the colonial policy under the British Empire. We focused on the differences between each of the major viceroys that existed and administered the territory between 1890 and 1914. We talked about some of the more problematic parts of that administration during that period, namely the attempted partition of Bengal in July 1905, which resulted in quite a strong backlash from Hindu communities within the particular region, and quite a strong sense of Hindu nationalism develop as well. This lesson is going to explore a similar line of inquiry, this time looking instead at the position of Egypt. And the first question that we're going to get to is, what was the position of Egypt within the British Empire during this period? Well, while India was under full administrative control throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s, the same cannot be said for the issue of Egypt. Instead, Egypt was what we would describe as a veiled protectorate. A veiled protectorate was a system of military occupation in which there was a general desire that Egypt be temporarily in control by the British. So the idea of permanent control or permanent administration, or even necessarily permanent ownership of a particular territory, was not seen as being the case when we look at Egypt. Instead, this idea of partial, temporary, veiled protectorate, military occupation was the position of Egypt in the empire during this time. And so the result of that was that who was in control of Egypt was the Sultan, not the British. And this was a system, essentially, where we see a number of different changes in policy, but we also see quite a significant distinction between this administration here and the administration of India. And the first thing I want to mention in regard to this idea of the veiled protectorate is this idea known as capitulation. This was a system in which certain protections were granted by the Sultan to Europeans who visited and resided within Egypt during this time. This would protect often Christians against the law that is applied under Muslim jurisdiction, things like the dhimmi system, for example. It would also have a number of implications, okay? So the implications would lead to a situation in which the lawmaking, in fact, was hindered as a result of this particular system. So, for example, one element of the capitulation policy was that if there was the proposal of new laws in and under this particular policy, the European countries whose citizens are residing in Egypt would have the ability to approve or reject them. This is obviously a problematic aspect of Egyptian lawmaking and a problematic aspect of the capitulation policy, because it could mean that essentially the Europeans who live and reside in Egypt during this time have quite a significant amount of power to be able to approve and reject laws, to basically control what laws are passed and what laws are not passed. That's obviously not great when you're trying as a sultan to administer your own region, to administer the Egyptian region yourself. So when we talk about finances and the way in which finance and policy would interact with each other, the vast majority of the Egyptian finances were controlled by a collection of European imperial states. These became known as the Cassis de la Tête. While this was an example of imperial control over the colonies of other regions, it actually hampered the British from being able to fully administer the region themselves. Remember, this is a number of European imperial states, so a number of states in Europe that were all competing against each other, if you remember back to previous videos, essentially had a certain degree of power and authority when it came to the controlling and the administering of finances in Egypt. So, for example, the Cassisi della Teti would, in fact, be able to block decisions on finance and spending that were made by the British Consul General. So, where the British wanted to have a bit more full administration of the region, maybe even control the Sultan in a more direct way, this particular collection of European imperial states that are able to essentially have joint control over the vast majority of Egyptian finances would mean that finance and spending would be able to be controlled by these states, obviously, and this would therefore remove a certain degree of authority and power that the British Consul General had in the region. So when we talk about the Egyptian governmental system, it was a partially elected system, and it would be consistent of a number of advisory councils. There also existed a general assembly within the Egyptian governmental system, but for the most part we have to be thinking about the ways in which the British would control this Egyptian government system. They would advise and support, in inverted commas, each government minister, but in reality this idea of quote-unquote support was more so a coercive position, because if a minister ignored the advice of the British advisor, again in quote-unquote, they could be dismissed. So even though it was seen on the surface as a sort of advisor-supported kind of role, in reality it absolutely wasn't. In reality it was a situation in which there was a certain degree of coercive authority that the British had over these Egyptian administrators and these Egyptian members of the government ministry system. So with all this being said then, what were the British interests in Egypt? You can see that they've sort of got their tentacles, if you will, very much in and around Egyptian finance, as well as the government system and the ways in which it is administered as a region. So what is the reasoning? What is the rationale, the raison d'etre for the British to have a certain degree of interest in Egypt? Why are they investing so much time and energy into Egypt? Well, the number of British nationals living and working in Egypt would continue to increase from the earlier period that we've already studied in 1885 and all the way up to 1905. And this steady increase would lead to around nearly 1,000 individuals. People such as Evelyn Baring, who was a British Consul General, was employed to have one main job, which was to try and maintain and manage the financial affairs of the Egyptian government. Remember, this obviously is impacted by the European states that had quite significant control over the Egyptian finances. In order to ensure that Egypt was able to pay quite considerable debts to the European bondholders, Baring was instrumental in instigating a more cautious economic and financial policy to ensure that they were not going to be financially and economically trapped by the European powers, or more so than they would otherwise have been. These more cautious and economically, financially conservative policies would include things like cutbacks in the administration itself, the administration of the territory, the reigniting of the economy through a variety of what we would describe today as sort of infrastructure projects. At the time, these were obviously irrigation projects specifically. The kind of heavy infrastructure was not something that was done much in Egypt during this period. There was also an insurance that there would be an increase in the exports of sugar from the Egyptian territory to the rest of the world in order to essentially increase revenue through exports. So when all is said and done, and we think about the administration of Egypt between the 1890s and 1914, who really were the winners and losers of this particular system? Well, generally speaking, the winners within Egyptian society were people who benefited from the occupation, generally speaking, were the upper classes in society. As with most areas of the empire, a nationalist movement would soon begin to develop, however, and people like Al-Hizib al-Watani, for example, movements like Al-Hizib al-Watani was nationalist movements that would begin to develop. So, for example, in 1881, this particular movement developed, not this person, this particular movement, should I say, and it became part of a secret party in 1893. The general aims of the Al-Hizb al-Watani were to essentially be able to end British occupation and try to replace this occupation with a representative elected government instead. Now, while ignoring the demands of the nationalists, the consul Bering would instead appoint a nationalist as Minister of Education, Said Pasha. This would try to essentially attempt to be able to reduce the amount of nationalist demand, or at least try to quell some of the major demands and sort of the major uprisings of these nationalist movements. The extent to which this would be successful is obviously something that is debated, and we will get to this in a bit more detail when we start to think about the relations between indigenous peoples and the British Empire in this territory at future parts and future stages of the specification.